The admissions desk looked at me like I was asking for the impossible. My son Eli was somewhere behind those swinging doors, and all I could think about was the word emergency. The woman behind the counter adjusted her glasses and said they needed a deposit before surgery could proceed. $2,000. Cash, credit, or check. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands. Eli had collapsed at soccer practice an hour ago. Appendicitis. The surgeon said it could rupture any minute. I had $800 in my account and a credit card that was already maxed out from last month's car repair. There was only one person I could call. My father, Richard Whitman. The man who owned half the commercial real estate in Portland and had his name on 3 hospital wings across the state. I dialed his number and waited while it rang 4 times. When he answered, his voice was flat and annoyed. "Claire, what is it?" "Dad, it's Eli. He needs emergency surgery right now. They're asking for $2,000 and I don't have it. I need your help." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said the words that would change everything. "You chose this life, Claire. Figure it out yourself." The line went dead. I sat in the green plastic chair in the waiting room and stared at my phone. My hands were still shaking. Around me, other families huddled together, whispering prayers or holding each other. I was alone. The words kept replaying in my head. "You chose this life." He meant I chose to marry Kyle, a teacher who died in a car accident 3 years ago. He meant I chose to keep working as a graphic designer instead of joining his company. He meant I chose independence over his control. A nurse with kind eyes approached me. Her name tag said Angela. "Ma'am, we found a way to get your son into surgery. There's a hospital assistance program. I submitted an emergency application on your behalf." I looked up at her, tears blurring my vision. "Thank you. Thank you so much." She squeezed my shoulder and walked away. I wanted to feel relieved, but all I felt was hollow. Across the waiting room, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. A bronze plaque on the wall, Richard Whitman Pediatric Wing, in honor of generous community leadership. My father's name, his generosity, for everyone except his own daughter. The surgeon appeared in the doorway, still wearing his scrub cap. His expression was serious. "Mrs. Porter, we need to talk." The surgery was successful. Eli's appendix hadn't burst, and the surgeon said he'd make a full recovery. I cried in that sterile hallway, pressing my hands against the cold wall, while nurses walked past pretending not to notice. But the relief lasted only until the social worker handed me the discharge papers 3 days later. Follow-up appointments. Antibiotics. Wound care supplies. Physical therapy to rebuild his core strength after the incision. The bill came to another $3,500 over the next 2 months. I sat in my small apartment that night after Eli fell asleep, sorting through a box of papers I'd kept in the back of my closet. Old tax returns, insurance documents, and a sealed envelope I'd found in my mother's desk after she died 4 years ago. I'd never opened it. The handwriting on the front said, "For Claire, when you need it most." My hands trembled as I tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper in my mother's careful script. "Claire, if your father ever refuses to help you when you truly need it, remember this. I made sure you would be protected. Trust the plan I put in place. Love always, Mom." I read it 3 times, trying to understand what she meant. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from my father's attorney. The letter was typed on heavy cream paper with a law firm's letterhead embossed at the top. Carson and Associates, attorneys at law. "Dear Ms. Porter, we represent Richard Whitman in all personal and estate matters. It has come to our attention that you may be experiencing financial difficulties. Please be advised that any past assistance provided by Mr. Whitman is subject to repayment terms outlined in attached documentation." I flipped through the pages. A list of college expenses. My wedding costs. A down payment on a car I'd purchased 7 years ago. Everything my father had ever given me, now itemized with dollar signs and interest calculations. The total came to $63,000. My vision blurred. My chest felt tight. This wasn't real. Parents didn't do this to their children. But Richard Whitman wasn't like other parents. He was a man who kept receipts for birthday presents and documented every favor like a business transaction. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I grabbed my phone and searched for family attorneys in Portland. The first available appointment was with someone named Ms. Catherine Avery. Her office was downtown, and she could see me the next afternoon. When I hung up, I sat on my couch and stared at the letter until the words stopped making sense. Then I remembered my mother's note. Trust the plan I put in place. Ms. Avery's office was small but organized. Law books lined the shelves, and her desk was stacked with neat folders. She was maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She read my father's demand letter twice, her expression never changing. Then she set it down and looked at me over her glasses. This is intimidation, not enforcement. Most of these so-called loans would be considered gifts under family law. He can't legally demand repayment unless you sign promissory notes. I felt my shoulders drop with relief. I didn't sign anything. He just gave me money when I needed it. Then this letter is empty threats. She tapped the paper with one finger. But I need to ask you something important. Has your father ever handled any paperwork for you? Bank accounts, tax filings, trust documents. I thought back to my early 20s. He managed some things when I was in college. He said it was easier if he handled the financial aid paperwork and tax returns. Ms. Avery wrote something in her notebook. I need you to pull your credit reports from all 3 bureaus and find any old tax receipts or financial documents from that time period. Why? Because men like your father don't stop at intimidation. They cover their tracks with paperwork. I left her office feeling steadier than I had in days. But her words stayed with me all the way home. That night, I remembered something. A storage unit. The storage unit was on the east side of Portland, in a facility my mother had rented years ago. After she died, the manager sent me a key and a bill. I'd been paying the monthly fee without ever visiting. The label on the unit door said Whitman, Estate. I unlocked the padlock and rolled up the metal door. Inside were boxes stacked 3 high, covered in dust. The air smelled like old paper and mothballs. I pulled down the first box and opened it. Medical records. Insurance policies. Letters between my mother and her attorney. The second box held ledgers. Handwritten columns of numbers dating back 20 years. Donations to charities. Contributions to political campaigns. Expenses labeled family support. I dug deeper. At the bottom of the third box, I found a folder marked Contingency Trust, Whitman Family. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside were legal documents, signed and notarized. A trust established by my mother before she died, funded with assets she'd kept separate from my father's control. And my name was listed as a beneficiary. But there was a condition. A clause typed in bold at the bottom of the third page. In the event that Richard Whitman refuses to provide necessary medical or financial support to Claire Whitman Porter or her dependent children, the contingency provisions shall be triggered. I read it again. And again. My mother had known. She'd known exactly who my father was. I took the folder to Ms. Avery's office the next morning. She read through the documents with a careful eye, flipping pages and making notes in the margins. This is ironclad, she said finally. Your mother set this up with a very specific purpose. The trust protects you and Eli if your father refuses medical support. But how do we prove he refused? Refusal must be documented. A voicemail. A witness statement. A written communication. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my recent calls. I have the voicemail from the day of Eli's surgery. I saved it. Ms. Avery's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Play it. I pressed the button. My father's voice filled the small office, cold and dismissive. You chose this life, Claire. Figure it out yourself. When it ended, Ms. Avery nodded slowly. That's refusal. Do you have a witness? The social worker at the hospital. Angela. She was standing right there when I made the call. Ms. Avery closed the folder. Then we have what we need. But this won't be handled by me alone. We need the trust administrator. Who's that? She looked at the signature on the last page of the trust document. A man named Gerald Halden. I'll contact him today. I left her office with the folder clutched against my chest, feeling like I was holding a weapon I didn't know how to use. Gerald Halden's office was in a quieter part of the city, inside a brick building with ivy growing up the walls. He was older than Ms. Avery, maybe 65, with white hair and a calm voice that reminded me of my grandfather. He sat across from me in a leather chair and folded his hands. I knew your mother well, he said. She was a careful woman. She loved you very much. I nodded, afraid that if I spoke I'd start crying. Ms. Avery sent me the documents. I've reviewed the trust provisions and the refusal clause. To move forward, I need 3 things: documented proof of refusal, evidence of medical need, and verification of financial hardship. I handed him the printed transcript of my father's voicemail. Then I gave him the hospital bills and Angela's written statement confirming what she'd witnessed. Mr. Halden reviewed everything in silence. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at me. This is sufficient. I'll file the trigger notice with the probate court and notify your father's legal team. What happens next? Your father will be informed. And he won't be happy. I left Mr. Halden's office feeling like I'd just stepped off a cliff. There was no going back now. 3 days later, my father showed up at my apartment. I was carrying groceries up the stairs when I saw him standing in the lobby. Richard Whitman, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, looking completely out of place in my building. Claire. I froze. What are you doing here? We need to talk. His voice was tight with anger. What the hell do you think you're doing with that trust? I shifted the grocery bag in my arms. I'm protecting my son. Something you refused to do. That trust is sentimental nonsense your mother set up when she wasn't thinking clearly. You can't actually enforce it. Mr. Halden thinks I can. His face went red. You're making a mistake. I will cut you off completely. You'll get nothing from me ever again. I looked at him and felt nothing but exhaustion. You already did that, Dad. In the hospital. When Eli needed you. He opened his mouth to argue, but I walked past him and up the stairs. That night, I wrote down everything he'd said. The date. The time. His exact words. Ms. Avery had told me to document everything. 2 days later, Mr. Halden sent an email. Probate counsel engaged. Hearing scheduled. My father wasn't bluffing. And neither was I. The invitation came a week later. Not a letter this time, but a text message from my father. Dinner. Friday. The Oakmont Club. We need to settle this like adults. The Oakmont Club was the most expensive country club in Portland. A place where men like my father made deals over steak and scotch. I almost didn't go. But Ms. Avery said it might be useful. If he makes an offer, listen. Don't accept. Just listen. So I went. The dining room was all dark wood and chandeliers. My father was already seated at a corner table, a glass of wine in front of him. He stood when I arrived, ever the gentleman in public. We ordered. We made small talk. And then he slid an envelope across the table. $10,000. Enough to cover Eli's medical bills and then some. All I need is your signature on this. I opened the envelope. A check. And a second document labeled Confidential Settlement and Non-Disclosure Agreement. I read the terms. In exchange for the money, I would agree never to pursue the trust trigger or speak publicly about my father's refusal to help. I set the papers down and pulled out a folded copy of the trust clause from my purse. I slid it across the table. I don't need your $10,000, Dad. I need you to understand what Mom put in place. He picked up the paper. His face went white as he read. You don't know what you're doing, he said quietly. I think I do. I left the check on the table and walked out. Ms. Avery and Mr. Halden worked together over the next 2 weeks. I brought them everything: medical receipts, income records, bank statements. Every piece of paper that proved I'd been struggling while my father lived in comfort. The trust included a provision I hadn't noticed before. A pediatric care fund. If the trigger was activated, the trust would match any medical expenses for Eli dollar for dollar, up to $50,000. My mother had thought of everything. But my father wasn't giving up. His attorney filed a motion to block the trust trigger, arguing that the refusal wasn't clear enough and that my mother hadn't been of sound mind when she created the trust. Mr. Halden's response was swift. He provided medical records showing my mother's mental clarity. He submitted the voicemail transcript. He attached Angela's witness statement. A court date was set. I had 6 weeks to prepare. Eli asked me one night why I seemed so worried. I told him everything was fine. But the truth was I was terrified. If I lost, I'd be right back where I started. Alone. Struggling. With a father who saw me as a debt to be collected. If I won, I'd have what my mother wanted me to have. Security. Protection. A future. I couldn't afford to lose. The courthouse was gray stone and intimidation. I walked through the metal detectors with Ms. Avery at my side, clutching a folder with all our evidence. My father was already there with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Vanessa Price. They sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. PR consultants, probably. My father always cared about appearances. The judge entered, and we all stood. Her name was Judge Helen Carmichael. She looked tired but focused. Ms. Avery leaned over and whispered, "She's fair." That's all we need. The hearing began with opening statements. My father's attorney painted me as ungrateful and opportunistic. She claimed I was exploiting my mother's sentiment to steal from my father's estate. Ms. Avery stood and spoke calmly. This isn't theft. It's accountability. Claire's mother created a legal safeguard because she knew her husband would refuse to help their daughter when she needed it most. And that's exactly what happened. The judge made a note and looked up. Let's hear from the witnesses. Angela, the hospital social worker, was called first. Her testimony was quiet but devastating. Angela sat in the witness box and answered every question with calm precision. Yes, she'd been present when I called my father. Yes, she'd heard me begging for help. Yes, she'd witnessed his refusal. What was the plaintiff's emotional state at that time? Ms. Avery asked. She was panicked. Her son was being rushed into emergency surgery, and she had no way to pay for it. She was shaking, crying. And what did the defendant say when she asked for help? Angela looked directly at my father. He told her she chose this life and to figure it out herself. The courtroom went silent. Next came the surgeon's testimony. He confirmed that Eli's surgery was urgent and that any delay could have been life-threatening. He also confirmed that I'd been visibly distressed about the financial barrier to care. Then Ms. Avery played the voicemail. My father's voice filled the courtroom. Cold, dismissive, final. I watched the judge's face as she listened. Her expression hardened. When the recording ended, she looked at my father. Mr. Whitman, I'm going to hear from you next. But first, I want to understand something. You have significant wealth. Your name is on hospital buildings. Why did you refuse to help your daughter when your grandson needed emergency surgery? My father stood slowly. His attorney whispered something, but he waved her off. I was teaching her independence, Your Honor. My father's testimony was exactly what I expected. Polished, rehearsed, full of phrases like tough love and personal responsibility. He claimed he'd always supported me, that he'd paid for my education, helped with my wedding, given me opportunities. He said I'd squandered them by choosing a modest life instead of ambition. Ms. Avery stood for cross-examination. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Mr. Whitman, you mentioned supporting Claire financially over the years. Did you ever document these gifts as loans? No. Did Claire ever sign promissory notes agreeing to repay you? No, but... And yet, you recently sent her a demand letter requesting repayment of over $60,000. Why now? He hesitated. I felt it was time she took responsibility. Or was it because she triggered a trust provision that you didn't want activated? His attorney objected. The judge allowed the question. Mr. Whitman, I'd like to talk about your charitable giving. You've donated millions to hospitals, schools, and community programs. Have you ever taken tax deductions for these donations? Of course. That's standard practice. Ms. Avery pulled out a document. This is a tax return from 8 years ago. You claimed a deduction for a donation made in Claire's name. Did she authorize that? Aye, it was a family donation. Did she authorize it? No. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Whitman, do you have documentation showing these family donations were made with consent? He didn't answer. Mr. Halden stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Claire's mother's financial ledger for review. The ledger was old, the pages yellowed and filled with my mother's careful handwriting. Mr. Halden walked the judge through entries dating back 15 years. Donations made in Claire's name. Charitable contributions attributed to the Whitman family that my mother had documented as unauthorized. Tax deductions my father had claimed for gifts that were never actually given. The judge studied the pages in silence. Then she looked at my father. Mr. Whitman, I'm ordering a temporary release of trust funds for Eli's medical care while this case proceeds. The court needs to review these financial records more carefully. My father's attorney stood. Your Honor, we request that these proceedings be sealed. My client's privacy. Denied. This is a matter of legal accountability, not family embarrassment. Ms. Avery caught my eye and gave a small nod. We were winning, but my father's attorney wasn't finished. She stood again, her voice sharp. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce evidence regarding Claire's financial history. Past debts. A failed engagement before her marriage. A pattern of poor decision-making that led to her current situation. The judge looked unimpressed. Counselor, this case is about whether a trust provision was properly triggered. Claire's personal history is irrelevant unless it directly impacts that question. It speaks to her credibility and motives. Denied. Move on. The The judge looked at Mr. Halden. I'm ordering a full accounting of the trust and any related estate documents. We reconvene in 30 days. Court was adjourned. The next 30 days were the longest of my life. Mr. Halden worked with an accounting firm to review every transaction related to my mother's trust and my father's estate. What they found was worse than I'd imagined. Entries labeled family support that had been diverted to my father's personal business ventures. Funds meant for my education that had been rerouted into investment accounts in his name. My mother's trust had been set up with clear intentions. But my father had treated it like his own piggy bank. Ms. Avery called me into her office to review the findings. Claire, this goes beyond the trust trigger. Your father has been mismanaging funds that weren't his to control. The judge is going to expand the scope of this case. What does that mean? It means this might touch his entire estate plan. I felt dizzy. I didn't want this. I just wanted help with Eli's medical bills. She looked at me seriously. I know, but your mother built in protections for a reason. She knew what he was capable of. The second hearing was scheduled. This time, my father looked different. Smaller. Older. His attorney filed motions to seal documents, to limit testimony, to delay proceedings. The judge denied them all. And then Mr. Halden dropped the final bomb. Your Honor, Mr. Halden said, standing with a thick folder in his hands. Claire's mother didn't just create a contingency trust. She tied control of certain estate assets to the trust trigger. If Richard Whitman refused medical support to his daughter or grandchild, specific assets would shift out of his control and into Claire's. The courtroom went completely silent. My father's face went pale. That's not possible. Mr. Halden opened the folder. It's not only possible, it's documented. Mrs. Whitman worked with me to establish these provisions 6 years before her death. She was very clear about her intentions. The judge took the folder and read. Her expression never changed, but I saw her eyebrows lift slightly. This is unusual, she said, but it appears to be legally sound. Mr. Whitman, were you aware of these provisions? No, my wife never told me. Because she knew you'd try to change them, Mr. Halden said quietly. My father's attorney stood. Your Honor, we move to seal these estate documents. This is private family business. Denied. I've already ruled on transparency. And given what I've seen in this accounting, I'm not inclined to protect Mr. Whitman's privacy over his daughter's rights. She closed the folder. We'll hear closing arguments next week. In the meantime, I'm ordering that no assets related to this case be moved or liquidated. My father stared at me across the courtroom. For the first time in my life, he looked afraid. The week before closing arguments felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of the hearings in my head, looking for mistakes. Ms. Avery assured me we'd done everything right. But I couldn't shake the fear that my father would find a way to win. He always did. The day of closing arguments arrived. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Word had spread about the case, and reporters sat in the back row, notebooks ready. My father's attorney went first. She argued that the trust provisions were punitive and unfair, that my mother had been manipulated into creating them, that I was using my son's medical crisis to steal from my father. Her voice was passionate, convincing. I felt my confidence waver. Then Ms. Avery stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get emotional. She simply laid out the facts. This case is about one thing: refusal. Richard Whitman refused to help his daughter when his grandson needed emergency surgery. That refusal was documented, witnessed, and recorded. Claire's mother anticipated this exact scenario and created legal protections for her daughter. Those protections are being triggered exactly as intended. She walked to the judge's bench and placed a single piece of paper down. Claire's mother wrote this in her own hand. I'd like to read it for the record. The courtroom went silent. Support is a duty, not a performance. Ms. Avery continued. Mrs. Whitman understood that her husband's generosity was selective. Public. Strategic. She watched him donate millions to hospitals while refusing to help his own daughter with basic needs. She saw him use family donations for tax benefits without their consent. She knew that when Claire needed him most, he would say no. She turned to face my father. And she was right. Ms. Avery returned to our table. The trust trigger is clear. The refusal is documented. The remedy is proportional. Claire isn't asking for revenge. She's asking for what her mother intended her to have: protection. The judge nodded slowly. Anything else? No, Your Honor. Then we're adjourned. I'll issue my ruling within 48 hours. I walked out of the courthouse with Ms. Avery. My legs felt weak. My hands were shaking. How do you think it went? I asked. I think your mother would be proud of you. 2 days later, the ruling came. I was at home with Eli when Ms. Avery called. I almost didn't answer. I was too afraid to hear bad news. But I picked up on the fourth ring. Claire, she said. You won. The judge's ruling was 9 pages long. I read it 3 times, unable to believe the words. The court finds that the trust trigger was properly activated. Richard Whitman's refusal to provide medical support to his grandson, despite substantial personal wealth and ability to help, meets the conditions outlined in the contingency trust created by the late Mrs. Whitman. Furthermore, the court finds evidence of financial mismanagement and unauthorized use of trust assets by Mr. Whitman. The contingent estate clause is hereby activated. Claire Whitman Porter is named executor of the contingency provisions and beneficiary of the designated assets. Mr. Whitman is barred from interfering with trust administration. A full audit and restitution process will be ordered. I sat on my couch and cried. Not from relief. From exhaustion. From grief for the father I'd wanted and never had. Eli came and sat next to me. Mom, why are you sad? I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm just tired. The next day, I went to the courthouse to receive the official documents. Mr. Halden met me there with Ms. Avery. As we walked out, my father was waiting in the hallway. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Defeated. Claire, he said. Please. Can we talk? Ms. Avery started to step between us, but I held up my hand. It's okay. She and Mr. Halden walked a few steps away, giving us space but staying close enough to intervene. My father looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Fear. Don't let them take everything. I looked at my father and felt something strange. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just sadness for what could have been. I'm not trying to take everything, Dad. I never was. Then drop this. Let's settle it privately. I'll give you what you need for Eli. We can work this out. I shook my head. It's too late for that. You had a chance to help when it mattered, and you chose not to. Mom knew you'd do that. She protected me because you wouldn't. She poisoned you against me. No, she loved you, but she loved me more. And she made sure I'd be okay when you weren't there. He looked down at his hands. For the first time in my life, I saw my father cry. What do you want from me, Claire? I want you to comply with the court order. I want you to repay what you took from the trust. I want you to accept that someone is going to oversee your finances to make sure this doesn't happen again. And if I do that, then we can have a relationship. A real one. Not based on your control or my debt. Just a relationship. He nodded slowly. I'll do what I have to. I walked away, leaving him standing in that hallway. Ms. Avery and Mr. Halden fell into step beside me. That was generous, Ms. Avery said. It was honest. We had one more meeting scheduled. The formal handover of executor documents. The conference room was quiet and professional. A long table, leather chairs, and a stack of documents waiting for signatures. Mr. Halden's assistant brought in folders containing keys, titles, and account information. Assets my mother had quietly set aside. A rental property in my name. An investment account. An education fund for Eli. Not a fortune, but enough to be secure. Enough to breathe. Mr. Halden walked me through each document, explaining what I was signing and what it meant. You're now the executor of the contingency provisions. That means you oversee the assets your mother designated for you. Your father can't touch them. Can't contest them. I signed each page carefully. My hand was steady. There's one more thing, Mr. Halden said. He slid a final folder across the table. During the audit, we found one last account that was misused. Funds that were meant for your education, but were diverted to one of your father's business ventures. How much? $42,000. Plus interest over 8 years. The court has ordered restitution from your father's personal accounts. I stared at the number. Money that should have been mine. Money my mother had set aside for my future. What do I do with it? Whatever you want. It's yours. I thought about Eli. About his future. About the life my mother wanted us to have. Put it in Eli's education fund. Mr. Halden nodded. Done. The meeting ended. I walked out carrying a leather portfolio containing the keys to a future I never expected. The restitution process took another month. My father's attorney kept trying to negotiate, to reduce the amounts, to drag things out. But Judge Carmichael had been clear. Full restitution. No exceptions. I didn't gloat. I didn't make public statements. I just let the process happen. The money came back into the trust in 3 separate transfers. Each one verified. Each one documented. Each one returning what my father had taken. Ms. Avery called when the final transfer cleared. "It's done, Claire. Every penny is back where it belongs." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in my apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. Not victory. Just peace. A week later, my father's attorney requested a meeting. Not in court. Not in a lawyer's office. Just a quiet coffee shop in downtown Portland. I agreed. Ms. Avery came with me. We sat across from my father and his attorney at a corner table. His attorney laid out a proposal. A compliance plan. Regular financial reporting. Independent oversight of his accounts. Boundaries about contact with me and Eli. No more surprise visits. No more demands. No more attempts to control my life through money. I read through it carefully. Ms. Avery made a few notes in the margins, suggesting changes. We negotiated for an hour. Finally, we reached terms we could all accept. I signed. My father signed. And it was over. 2 weeks later, I took Eli to the hospital for his final follow-up appointment. The surgeon examined his incision, checked his range of motion, and declared him fully healed. "No restrictions," he said with a smile. "He can go back to soccer whenever he's ready." Eli grinned. "Can I play this weekend?" "Sure can, buddy." We walked out of the hospital together. The afternoon sun was warm on my face. Eli ran ahead, full of energy, while I followed more slowly. I passed the bronze plaque in the lobby. My father's name still gleamed under the overhead lights. Richard Whitman Pediatric Wing. I wondered if he'd ever understand what my mother had done. She hadn't tried to punish him. She'd tried to protect me from having to choose between my pride and my son's health. She'd given me a third option. Accountability. I thought about calling my father. Maybe to thank him for complying with the court order. Maybe to invite him to one of Eli's soccer games. But not today. Today, I just walked out into the sunlight with my son, knowing that we were safe. That the bills were paid. That the future was secure. Not because someone gave it to us. Because someone made sure we could claim it when we needed it most. 25 that night, after Eli was asleep, I opened my mother's note one more time. The paper was soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. "Claire, if your father ever refuses to help you when you truly need it, remember this. I made sure you would be protected. Trust the plan I put in place. Love always, Mom." I'd trusted the plan. And it had worked. Not the way I'd imagined winning would feel. There was no triumph. No celebration. Just the quiet knowledge that my mother had seen the future clearly and built a bridge across it. I folded the note carefully and placed it in the wooden box where I kept important things. Birth certificates. Eli's immunization records. The deed to the rental property my mother had left in my name. The keys to a future I never expected. Through the window, I could see the city lights of Portland glowing in the distance. Somewhere out there, my father was probably sitting in his large house, alone with his ledgers and his pride and the consequences of his choices. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't need to. My mother had given me something better than revenge. She'd given me protection, independence, the ability to say no to control and yes to boundaries. The Pediatric Care Fund was fully activated now. Eli's follow-up appointments were covered. His physical therapy was paid for. Even his soccer registration fees came from the trust provisions my mother had built in, because she'd thought of everything, down to the smallest details of a boy's normal life. I walked to Eli's bedroom and stood in the doorway, watching him sleep. His chest rose and fell steadily. The scar from his surgery was healing well, already fading to a thin line that would one day be barely visible. He would never remember the panic of that day. The fear. The desperate phone call to a grandfather who said no. But he would grow up knowing that his grandmother had loved him before she ever met him. That she'd protected him from a future where love came with conditions and price tags. And maybe when he was older, I'd tell him the full story. About the trust. About the court case. About the day his mother learned that some inheritances aren't money. They're boundaries that let you build a life on your own terms. I closed his door quietly and returned to the living room. My phone buzzed. A text from Ms. Avery. Final compliance report filed. Everything's in order. You did it, Claire. I typed back. My mother did it. I just had the courage to claim it. 3 dots appeared then. She'd be proud of you. I set the phone down and walked to the window. The city lights blurred as tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. From exhaustion. From the strange, overwhelming feeling of being truly safe for the first time in years. Tomorrow, I'd take Eli to soccer practice. I'd work on my design projects. I'd pay bills without panic. I'd make plans that extended past next month. I'd live the life my mother had fought to give me. But tonight, I just stood in the quiet of my small apartment and felt the weight of 2 years lift from my shoulders. Some inheritances aren't money, I thought again. They're the knowledge that someone loved you enough to see the future and stand guard over it. They're the boundaries that let you say, I chose this life. And it's mine. I touched my fingers to the window glass, looking out at the city where my mother had lived, where she'd planned, where she'd built protections I didn't even know I'd need. Thank you, Mom, I whispered into the darkness. And somewhere, in the space between memory and hope, I felt her answer. You're welcome, sweetheart. You're welcome.